Hi, I'm back with another video after a long absence. This time I want to talk about LAN parties, specifically LAN parties that happened on the California Bay Area, West Coast kind of area, and specifically LAN parties that happened between the year 2000 and around 2010, because for me, having experienced this sort of subculture, I guess you could say it is. I felt like between those years, that 10-year period was saw the rise and sort of fall of LAN parties as we knew them. LAN parties exist to this day, but they're not quite the same. And I'll try to describe what I mean by that later in this video. But for now, I just want to go through the basics and walk you through what is a LAN party, why were LAN parties a thing, what type of LAN parties were there, and what went on at these things, and kind of at what point did it kind of start to fade away. So, and why. And that's what I'll be getting into in this video. So stick around and we'll get into it.
Unless you are a die-hard computer gamer, it's a good bet you've never heard of LAN parties. They are caffeine-driven gaming marathons that are breeding a new type of weekend warrior.
So what is a LAN party? Well, basically, LAN stands for Local Area Network, and that is the network that you would set up for computers to talk to each other so that you could play games. And that was the whole purpose, was playing games, and it usually involved trying to get as many people as you can to bring their own computer to a central location where you would set up the network. You had to make sure there was enough power at the whatever building it was, whether it be somebody's house or community center or what have you. And there'd need to be tables and chairs, and that's kind of what the host, whoever was hosting the event, was responsible for. And everyone else just show up with your computer and your monitor, obviously, and peripherals, and connect in to the network and start gaming. And it was usually over a 24-hour period, sometimes over an entire weekend, that these things would happen. And there was a whole lot of, other stuff that went along with it. Just general hanging out and eating junk food, barbecue, playing games, but also there's also a lot of file sharing going on and all sorts of other things that made it a lot of fun. And there a whole community of people kind of grew up around this sort of scene, and that's really what it became. And it became not just about playing games, but also about seeing all of your friends and all these people in this community that you come to know. Part of it was also showing off your computer. It was kind of, I liken it to sort of like a hot rod or something, because it's something that you kind of built yourself. You cobbled together out of all these different parts that you got from everywhere, and each one was a little bit different, sometimes a lot different. And that was part of the challenge, was how to differentiate your computer from the next guy's. And a lot of people painted their stuff and had windows in it and lights and all that kind of stuff, and water cooling systems.
My name is Dima, and I'm with the Mowers clan. And here's my completely custom rig. Main part of the rig is the water blocks. I machined those myself at my old high school. So I didn't buy them from like SwiftTech or Danger Dan. I actually machined all of my water blocks right there, the red water blocks. There's one big one on the CPU, one for the chipset, and 3 on the video card. One for the back side of the RAM, one for the front side of the RAM, and one for the GPU itself.
So half of the fun was kind of looking around to see what kind of crazy case mods or things that people have done, and talking about the specs and stuff. And it's the same thing with hot rod guys. You walk around like, well, what kind of engine is in there? Blah, blah, blah. You know, it's the same with PC stuff. It's what kind of video card do you have in there? What kind of processor is that? Where'd you get that? You know, how did you do that to your case, and etc. So that was part of the fun and part of the culture that sprung up around it.
See, because it looks all clean and neat in the front, but in the back it's a mess of cable. You don't want to open a window over there.
So why did this even become a thing? Well, it was mainly due to two reasons. First, it was multiplayer games became a thing. If you wanted to play a shooter or a strategy game or something like that, there was really no substitute for playing against an actual real person. So this started to become available in the mid to late 90s with things like Doom and Quake and Duke Nukem and things like that. They started building in LAN play into the game itself. So it became a thing that you could do, and there was even online play available in a lot of these, but that at the time, the main way to do that was a dial-up connection, which was very slow. So um, this was part of the motivation for LAN parties to exist, because we've got these games, we want to play them, but our connections are too slow to play them online at this point. So what do? Well, let's all meet together in some place and we'll have a fast connection, because obviously connecting directly to each other over a network in a same location is going to be way faster than trying to dial up and connect to somebody, you know, across the country. So LAN parties become a thing. So you make an event out of it, out of everybody getting together to play these games. And in the early days, it was not something that was easy to do. Well, partly because, you know, Windows 95 or even 98 wasn't that great or easy or user friendly as far as getting a network together. Networking equipment was expensive. Even Cat5 cable was expensive then. And so you kind of had to know what you were doing, or you had to know somebody who knew what they were doing, which was kind of not that easy sometimes back in the early days. It wasn't until the early 2000s that, you know, the equipment started to become a little bit more affordable, easier to use, and setting up a network became more intuitive, I guess. And the games became a lot more streamlined as far as being able to connect to each other and things like that. So I would mark the 2000 as sort of the, even though LANs and things were a thing before then, in the early 2000s, more people had computers and were willing to or wanted to play against other people. Broadband hadn't caught up to things. I know I lived in the middle of Silicon Valley and I didn't have broadband until well into the 2000s. So that's kind of how it was. It was a necessity kind of thing, but it also turned out to be a lot of fun, and a whole kind of community rose out of it.
This is sort of an underground movement. There are entire web pages dedicated to LAN parties. Some of these parties are huge and for profit.
So another thing that happened in the early 2000s was there was a website called landparty.com. And before that, you had to kind of know somebody who knew what they were doing, who could set up a network, who wanted to do it. And I didn't have very many friends that were motivated to or even had their own computers or things like that. So what I was forced to do was I actually built a LAN at my house, and I had 4 computers in my room, and my friends would just come over and we play on that. But there's always the need for bigger and better. How can we get more players in on this thing, and how can we make it bigger and better? So I think 1999 was the first time I'd hosted a LAN at my house. and I'd convinced some friends to bring their home computer over, and we played Half-Life Deathmatch all night long, and it was glorious. And that kind of started it. So at that point, I had as many house LANs at my house as I possibly could. And I discovered around 2000, 2001, the existence of landparty.com, and what that was a sort of a news site about LAN parties, but also it had the big list, and you could look at the list, and it had postings of people who were hosting LAN parties all over the world, and you could sort it by region. So I could look at the West Coast region, I could see everything that was happening and kind of look for things that were happening near the city that I lived in and see if it was something I could go to. And if you were hosting a LAN party, you could post your LAN party up on the big list and basically invite whoever saw it to come to your event. And a lot of times, these some of these events were just stuff at people's houses, which is brave of them to invite just anonymous people to their houses. So there wasn't a lot of those. There was a few, but not many. But most of them, it was hosted at some kind of community center or something like that. In fact, the first one I ever went to was at a trailer park community center, where it was the little building next to the pool area, and they had around 50, 30 to 50 people probably showed up to that one. And that was really cool. And it was the first time I'd seen with my own eyes that there were other people like me that were out there that wanted to do this thing and that were into networking and PC gaming and all this kind of stuff. After a while, I went to enough of these things that I started to kind of become familiar with the people that were there and felt part of the community. The biggest one I'd went to probably in the early 2000s was called the Big Bang, and BANGG, and that stood for Bay Area Network Game Group or something like that. And they hosted an event at the Santa Clara Convention Center, and that's a big spot, and it was huge. I looked up some sign up list from the Wayback Machine, and there was 50 or 60 people signed up, but I remember there being a lot more than that there. I think there had been at least 100 people at that event, and it was big, and that was overwhelming too. So again, I didn't know anybody at that time. I would become friends with some of the people that were at that show later, but yeah, that was huge, and that kind of opened my eyes to like how big a thing this LAN party stuff was. That you can actually rent out a whole convention center for this thing and fill it up. So that was really cool to see that. And then it was after that, there were other LAN events that I was watching landparty.com and trying to figure out what was going on around me, and I noticed there were other groups that did pretty regular events. One of them was LG LAN in Los Gatos, and another one was Lantrocity, I think, and they were in Roseville or Sacramento, someplace like that. And there was a few other groups that kind of had popped up and that were doing regular events, and kind of had their own communities in these different places. One of the best ones that I ever experienced was called Octane LAN, and that was in Los Gatos, and it was supported by the LG LAN group, at least at first. Basically, it was at this church in Los Gatos, which sounds weird, but it was actually really cool. And it was in an old kind of timey church building with the big vaulted ceiling. So it's a big open space. It had great acoustics and a great sound system. And they were pumping techno music in there all night long, basically. And later, as the events progressed throughout the years, they actually had live DJs come in and perform live or spin records live or whatever for these events. And it was really cool. And the event got bigger and bigger every time they did it. And they did it for pretty close to monthly for about a year, maybe a year and a half. They did 11 events total from I think 2002 to 2003. Yeah, and that was a very cool event, and in my opinion, set the high watermark, the gold standard of what that sort of mid-sized LAN event could be and should be. And everyone that attended those events really remembers them fondly. So those, and that was probably the first time, going to those events was the first time that I felt part of the community, because I actually started to get to know people, and people started recognizing me and I would recognize them, and everybody called each other by their gamer handle. That was the thing. Like, a lot of times I didn't even know these people's real names, and they didn't know mine, and we all just talked to each other like we were in Top Gun and Maverick and Goose and Iceman or what have you. And those events were probably between, I think they started out 30 or 40 people and got to about, I would say, pretty close to, if not over 100 people by the end of it. I think the staff maybe got burned out on doing it after a while, but they were definitely the best LAN events in the Bay Area, in my opinion. They were really a lot of fun and well done. Also, they were $15 and you got food with it. So they had a barbecue with hot dogs and hamburgers outside, and they even had, like, if you stayed all night, which everybody did, and the next morning there was donuts and light breakfasts and things like that available, which was pretty awesome. And for the price, you couldn't beat that. And I think for the church, they saw it more as like a community outreach kind of a thing. So a lot of it was basically subsidized by the church. They didn't need to worry about covering their costs or making money or anything like that. They were just doing it as sort of a community kind of thing, which was really cool. So during the 2002, 2003 era, um, more and more LAN parties started happening. If you looked at the LANparty.com big list, it was huge and it was worldwide. So this community thing was growing, and it was growing everywhere, not just the Bay Area, but everywhere. And I think companies started to take notice of this, and they realized that the type of people, and I'm talking about companies like NVIDIA and Intel, and even smaller, more boutique companies that catered to people that modded their computers and built, sold custom windows or fan grills. All these types of companies were popping up all over the place. And, so those smaller companies, and even like energy drink, people like Balls started out around then, I think, and they would sponsor all of these types of events, or at least were willing to sponsor them. It wasn't that hard to get sponsored by them. You really just had to have a website and show that you had a decent attendance of 20 or 30 people, and usually they'd send you some kind of stickers or posters, or sometimes free product depending on what it was. I think in order to get a free product from something like Intel, you had to at least have 100 people or so regularly at your LAN, and maybe they'd send you a processor or something to give away in a raffle or something like that. But this was happening, and like I said, these companies were taking notice of this community and realizing that it was a good marketing opportunity for them, in that the people that went to LANs were very tech savvy, and And usually they built not only their own computers, but or several of their own computers, but they also built computers for their friends and their families. And they were, you know, anybody who knew anything about computers in the early 2000s was automatically tech support for any of their friends or family that didn't know anything about computers. So you became, just by fact of you built your own computer, now you are the automatic guru of computers to all of your non-tech friends and family. So that meant that whenever they needed something, or they needed a new part for their computer or what have you, you were the guy that they went to ask, like, what should I buy? What do I need? Can you fix this? Help me build this, whatever it was. So that meant that all of these LAN party goers were very influential in among their friends and family groups, right? So not only were you, as a computer building enthusiast, buying tons of parts for yourself, but you were probably recommending tons of parts for your friends and families and all the non-tech people that you knew. Uh, in addition, a lot of these people were probably or could be IT tech professionals, and may or may not have an influence on deciding what kind of gear went into the companies they worked for. So the companies like Nvidia and Intel especially saw this as a good opportunity to sort of win these highly influential group of people to their side and become fans of their brand, you know, by virtue of giving away free stuff and free swag and posters and all this stuff. And it worked. I think it worked really well. And it worked for not only for these companies and winning fans to their brand, but also for the LAN parties themselves and the attendees, because you got an air of sort of legitimacy to your LAN event if you could say, oh, we're sponsored by Intel or we're sponsored by Nvidia. And the attendees themselves benefit from it because they get a lot of free stuff to take home with them, and potentially new parts for their computer if it's a big enough LAN and they happen to be lucky to enough to win the raffle or what have you. So that worked out pretty well for everyone involved. So in 2003, that saw the beginning of the West Coast's biggest LAN party event ever, and which continues to this day, and that is PDX LAN in Portland, Oregon. And that started in July of 2003. And it was, I think, 500 people the first time, and I believe it just continued to grow from there. I think it was the second event that they had. One of the people in my clan either found out about it or went to it. I can't remember what it was, but he got real excited about it, and he kind of made us do a pilgrimage to the third PDX LAN. I believe that was 2004. And that became like this mind-blowing experience to us because we had never experienced anything that big before. It was gigantic, and Intel, Nvidia, and a bunch of other companies were fully on board with that, and they didn't have just one or two things to give away. They had tons of stuff to give away. So a lot of us came home with brand new parts. I know I came home with a motherboard, a processor, RAM, and I think some other stuff. So I practically came home with a brand new PC from going to that event. And that was a combination of raffle winnings and a tournament. I entered a Command and Conquer Generals tournament, and I got second place, and that's where I got the RAM from. So it was a really cool event, and that kind of put that event on our radar in the Bay Area, and we went on several subsequent pilgrimages to the promised land of Portland, Oregon to attend that event. But that was by far the biggest event around, and it's like I said, it still continues to this day, and they're pretty much the ones left carrying the torch of LAN parties these days. So if you want to attend a LAN party, that's pretty much your only option, if you don't already know somebody who's like doing a garage LAN or what have you. The PDX LAN thing, uh, they, by doing their events, they created some pretty good partnerships with Intel and NVIDIA. And in 2004, the staff of PDX LAN was contracted by NVIDIA to run their LAN party area at their big GeForce LAN in the Bay Area. And the GeForce LAN was run by NVIDIA, and it was part LAN party, fan fest type of event, but it was also a big press conference and product launch for their GeForce 6 series of cards. So Vector, the guy who runs PDX LAN, and his whole crew came up to run the LAN party section of that event. They got tons of coverage out of this, especially online. All sorts of different outlets picked it up, and it was worldwide news. I didn't get to go to that event, but some people in my clan did, and they took a lot of nice pictures, and we uploaded those to our clan website. And within 24 hours, our website was crashed because we got linked to so many different websites all around the world. And there were so many people trying to look at these pictures and see what the event was like, and find out the information from the event. There was no YouTube or any kind of thing that you could watch a replay of it. It was there was a hunger for people looking for content from this event, and so many people trying to find it that, our website got crashed from the amount of traffic that resulted from this. So I think NVIDIA realized that this was a great marketing tool for them, and they ended up doing a GeForce LAN pretty much every year for the next 5 years. I think the last one was Envision '08, which was also a big giant expo and had lots of vendor booths and things like that. So it was kind of like a convention slash LAN party slash press conference slash whatever kind of event. And then there was a break for a number of years. And then in 2011, there was GeForce LAN 6, and that was the last of the GeForce LANs. But the GeForce LANs were pretty legendary in their size and scale, especially for the Bay Area. Like, you had to have a lot of money and a lot of, basically a lot of money, and a lot of pull to be able to pull something like that off in the Bay Area, just because venues are very expensive out here, and just trying to rent the stuff and get the gear, all that stuff was pretty much out of the reach of anybody except a big company like NVIDIA. So for us LAN party enthusiasts, we were always very hyped to attend a GeForce LAN, and that was sort of like you had to be at this event whenever they had it. So it was a pretty big deal. They weren't the only ones to do these big, what I call corporate LANs. The publishing company Future, who published PC Gamer and Maximum PC, they put together their own LAN event starting in 2006 called Showdown LAN, and their approach was to promote their magazine for one, but they also had more of an expo type of model to it, where there was a big LAN area, but there was also an expo area. And, being a magazine, they had advertising agreements and stuff with a whole bunch of different companies. So it was easy for them to reach out to all their advertising partners and offer them, obviously they had to pay, but they could pay to have a booth at this event and be able to market their product directly to the consumers at this event. And that worked out pretty well. I worked for a company, Case and Power Supply Company, at that time, and we bought a booth at this event, so I kind of got to see it both from the attendees point of view but also from a sponsor point of view, and having a small booth there with product on display and raffled prizes. Like, we raffled some of our products off in there was a big stage, and that was another thing that you could pay to have a stage presentation where you basically can pitch your product directly to the attendees, and then there'd be a giveaway or some kind of prize to kind of keep everybody excited and engaged. So those were some of the marketing opportunities that were there and available by this sort of model of a LAN party. And NVIDIA, like I said, would later adopt this kind of model with their Envision event, where they had a whole expo area that was bigger than anything else, off to one side of it, and that's where all their kind of partner booths and things were. PDX LAN even tried this at one point. I think it was 2005, and they had the PD Expo, I think is what they called it, and they had a bunch of partner booths, including NVIDIA and Intel, and I think they had the U.S. Army. They had a bunch of people there with sponsor booths, and that was at the convention center in Portland. So that was definitely another level to this corporate LAN party model that happened. So as you can see, there was big business and big money in this kind of scene, and there was a lot of marketing opportunities that a lot of these companies saw, and which is why it got to become such a big thing. So if I were to break down the different types of LAN parties that there were, at the top, the biggest of the big were the corporately sponsored, funded LAN parties, right? Like the Showdown LAN and the NVIDIA GeForce LAN and things like that. PDX is just as big as those, but they were kind of in their own sort of realm, because they weren't really a corporation like NVIDIA or what have you. They had the backing of those companies via prizes and things like that, but they were really their own entity, and they ran it themselves, basically. But those were the biggest ones you could get, was corporate LANs and PDX LAN. They were on top. That's 500 plus people involved. After that, you had sort of the mid-tier types of events, and that was probably around about 100 people. Usually 50 to 100 people were, probably 30 to 100 people, I guess. It was a pretty big mid-range thing, and this was all community-driven types of events. And usually you had to have some kind of an in to a space to have it. That was the hardest part to hosting a LAN, especially in the Bay Area, because there's not a lot of vacant buildings or anything sitting around out here. Real estate is very expensive and valuable. So you had to have a spot where you could have an event, and then you also had to have enough gear to outfit the LAN and things like that. So that was a challenge, but there were a few pretty good groups. Like I already mentioned, Octane, LG LAN. They did regular events. Lantrocity did events. They expanded even to San Francisco, where they found a studio space in the Dog Patch area where they had some fairly regular LANs out there. There's one called LAN Surge in Sacramento. They did theirs at an old roller skating rink. So it was a big open space with a lot of power there that they could set up tables and chairs and stuff on the skating rink. part of it. So like I say, you had to have kind of a unique space to be able to do these things, and not everybody had access to that kind of thing, but they existed. And so that was sort of this middle tier area of the lands. Those didn't happen that often, but when they did, they were called also Ascendancy Land. I should mention them. They happened in San Francisco and an art gallery space. I helped briefly with one called SV Frag, Silicon Valley Frag Fest. The first one I wasn't a part of, but that was at an office building of some kind of a tech startup. And the second one, which I was involved in, happened at an e-waste recycling place, and it was a big warehouse. Had to move all the e-waste stuff to the outskirts, and then we had a big open concrete floor to set up tables and chairs. So that was a big undertaking, but that was, and that's how we did it. It was a lot of fun. And then the entry level tier, or the lowest, smallest, I guess I should say, is the house LAN. And there were always a lot of these going on, and it was usually in between bigger events. People would organize a LAN at their house, and usually like let's barbecue and set up in the living room or their garage or what have you, and play all night. And usually that was 10 to maybe even 20, depending on how big the house was, kind of a thing. But those happened all the time, and it was usually between groups of close friends and things like that. So that was kind of the scene. So my opinion, probably 2004, 2005 were peak LAN party years. At least for me personally, I was attending those things once a month at least. In the summertime, is probably more like once a week. And it was great. It was everything from the big corporate LANs to the small house LANs and everything in between. And I also ran my own gaming clan, and the clan was getting bigger and bigger, and we had a huge community. So many that when there were big community LANs or corporate LANs, we could block out rows, sometimes several rows, just for our group or our clan. And that was a lot of fun. There was tons of stuff going on, and a huge community, and new people coming in all the time in those days. And as the years went on, there was less and less of it, and part of the reason was there was usually only one, maybe two of the big corporate LAN events a year. There was a GeForce LAN for a lot of years that you could kind of look forward to every year. And then there was maybe a Showdown LAN. And then if you made the pilgrimage to PDX LAN, those were the big events of the year. And then you try to fill in between those times, try to go to as many of the mid-sized community LANs as you could, and then fill in, with house LANs and whatnot whenever you could. But over time, it became harder and harder for the community LANs to happen. And part of it, in my opinion, was, it was already hard to find a spot, especially in the Bay Area, to have a LAN event. Like I said, because they're expensive. So you either had to find somebody that had a space that they weren't using, or that they were willing to kind of let you use for a weekend. And that facility had to have enough power, was one, and then you had to figure out where to get the tables and chairs. So those were your barriers to entries, and it was considerable, especially when you're a kid with no real income, and you kind of all had to pool your resources to try to get enough equipment and gear together to kind of do one of these things. And then you pray that you don't lose money. Usually in these things, you'd be lucky or stoked if you could just break even. Some people were crazy enough to think that they could make money doing these things, but that is turned out to be a fantasy and a lot of people found out the hard way. I remember, I think the Lantrosity group kind of tried to turn it into a business. I don't think that turned out too well. There was another group called Monster Frag, and they put on a lot of really good events. But I think they tried to get a little bit too big too quick and kind of turn it into a business, and that unfortunately did not work out. Um, so there it was a struggle to do these community lands as it was, and then with the advent of Steam, slowly all of not all, but over the years, more and more games got to be on Steam. At first, it was just Half-Life, so you really only had to worry about Steam if you were playing Half-Life. Everything else you could just install on your computer, create a LAN game, and no big deal. You were good to go. But with the advent and popularity of Steam, you kind of had to be online all the time for it to work. Obviously, Steam has this offline mode, but it's a little unwieldy to get going. You really need to have a constant internet connection, and that creates a brand new barrier to hosting these community type LANs. And that was, how do I get a big enough internet connection to host all of these people? When it came to, you want to get 20 or 30 people in there downloading stuff all at once, regular connections just not going to cut it. So that became a pretty big problem, and a kind of a barrier to hosting LANs. It just became unfeasible for many of the groups, almost all of them really. And so that section of the community just began to shrink. And so you were left with people, you could do it at your house if you had a decent connection and enough room, but you were just doing that with your friends. So the community part of it, I would say, started to suffer at that point, because really you were relying on these big tentpole LAN events like GeForce LAN or Showdown LAN. And that was where you were able to access sort of the larger community and sort of meet new people that you could then invite to your LAN or to your clan or to your house LAN or what have you. But without those big tentpole events, there was really no access to the wider LAN party area. To top it off, in 2009, 2010, around there, LANparty.com went offline. And so that was really the lifeline of the whole community right there, because you couldn't even find out about if somebody was able to get a community style mid-range LAN going in your area. Without LANparty.com, you wouldn't know about it. You'd be hard pressed to find out unless it was just word of mouth or somebody you knew found out about it. And barring that, you just wouldn't even know. So that was kind of the nail in the coffin for the LAN party community, unfortunately. And like I said, that happened 2009, 2010. And from then on, it was sort of a downward spiral in that, that it was harder to find new LANs. It was harder to find out about LANs. It's harder to host LANs. I know I myself tried really hard to try to keep the whole community going. Amongst my clan members, and that was hard enough, but we were trying to find ways to host community LANs. We hosted a few here and there post 2010, but it was difficult, and difficult just to get people to hear about it and to come to it. So that was a big part of it. The other thing that I think maybe was tangentially related to it was towards the end of the decade. Well, I would say throughout the decade, there was kind of a side shoot to multiplayer gaming, and that was esports. And esports was kind of its own separate thing for the most part. Like if you went to a LAN party, you were there to hang out and just be with people and play games, and it wasn't really a super competitive thing. Sometimes there were tournaments, but they were most of the time pretty laid back, and not too intense at all. It was just sort of a side thing that if you wanted to do it, you could. And some people took it real seriously, but most people as far as I could tell, it wasn't the main reason for going, wasn't to compete. But as and that was as early as video games, was the esports thing. As early as I think 2000, there was the Cyber Athlete Professional League and World Series of video games, and there was a few other ones. But those were a thing, but they were their own kind of separate things. But after a while, towards the end of this decade, they started to kind of meld together a little bit. And at some of the bigger lands, there would be more of a serious tournament thing, and there would be teams that would travel around to try to compete in these things. And so there became more of a kind of a, what are we doing here? Is this a party, or is it a tournament, or is it both? And it was a little bit of a crossroads, I think. And I think a lot of the sponsors and the companies involved realized that there was more money to be made in something like esports rather than just having a fan party or community party kind of a thing. So I feel like some of the corporate money and attention went more towards the esports side around the end of the 2000, in the 2010 era, and there was less of a focus on the fans and the influencer types of people that were sort of the target of the community LAN parties. So I think that may have also contributed to kind of the downward spiral of the whole LAN community. So that's my breakdown of LAN parties throughout 2000, 2010. Obviously, it's just confined to the geographic area that I was in, so I'm sure that your experience may have been much different, but I'd love to hear about it in the comments of what your LAN party experience was, especially during that time, but especially now too. Like if you do LAN parties today, where do you find out about them? How do you promote them? Where do they happen? I'd love to hear about that, because as of now, the only one that I know of that's the community-based LAN that's still happening is still PDX, and they're still 500 plus people strong, and I hope they continue as long as they possibly can, because I think that's a great event. And if you ever get a chance to attend that event, I highly recommend that you do it. Until then, you're probably going to be stuck like me with just the odd house LAN here and there, because as far as I'm aware, there are no more mid-sized community LANs in the area anymore. But again, if you know different, feel free to tell me in the comments. For now, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video.
All right, you know what? This was dumb. Dump it. Trash it. This was garbage.